I caught my future daughter-in-law pouring industrial-grade superglue over the exact spot where my disabled wife was supposed to sit. And the worst part was my own son was standing right beside her, keeping watch and laughing. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I handled it the way a man who spent 40 years in commercial construction handles a structural flaw. I took care of it without a word. 2 hours on, when the master of ceremonies called the glowing bride to her feet. For that opening dance, the sound of $18,000 worth of designer lace being torn apart rang out across a dead silent ballroom, and she couldn't move an inch. But to grasp how my son's flawless wedding collapsed into a disaster entirely of his own creation, you need the full picture of what unfolded in those 2 hours before anyone said, "I do." My name is Franklin Beckett, 70 years old. I gave everything I had to raising a commercial contracting company up from bare ground. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into the story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Drop a quick thought. What do you hope to walk away with after a story like this one? A little comfort, a little justice, or something else entirely? I read every single one. Now, a quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the message at the heart of it all. I know the smell of drywall, the weight of steel, and the exact price of loyalty. It was a Saturday morning, precisely 2 hours before guests were due to arrive at the most exclusive luxury wedding venue in the city. I was there early because I had just paid $18,000 out of my own pocket to upgrade the ballroom sound system. Corwin, my son, had casually mentioned that the standard setup would ruin their wedding photos. Like the fool I was, I wrote the check. I wanted everything perfect for him. The grand ballroom stood completely empty, wrapped in the dim hush stillness that settles over a space just before something enormous fills it. The caterers were out at the loading dock, and the florists had already finished their elaborate centerpieces. I moved quietly across the thick carpet, just an old man taking in the expensive setup he had bankrolled. But as I neared the raised platform where the sweetheart table and immediate family seating had been arranged, I heard something. A low, muffled giggle. I froze, letting the darkness of the stage wings swallow me. Standing right at the edge of the family table were my son, Corwin, and his bride-to-be, Sienna. Sienna was not yet in her wedding dress. She had on a satin robe with the word bride monogrammed across the back, but she wasn't holding makeup or a mirror. She was gripping a heavy industrial squeeze bottle. She was bent over the plush, velvet-cushioned chair bearing a gold name tag that read, "Eloise, my wife, Corwin's mother." Eloise had suffered a mild stroke 8 months ago. She pulled through, thank God, but her mobility took a serious hit. She walked with a cane, moved carefully, and had to wear protective adult undergarments because she occasionally lost control of her bladder under stress or physical strain. It was a humiliating reality for a proud woman, and we guarded it as a strict family secret. Sienna knew this. Corwin knew this. I stood there feeling my blood turn to ice as Sienna squeezed a thick, clear gel directly onto the center of Eloise's velvet cushion, smearing it in wide circles, working it deep into the fabric fibers. Corwin was right beside her, cutting glances toward the main doors. He nudged her with his elbow. "Make sure you get the edges," I heard him whisper. "If she shifts around, I want to make sure it holds." Sienna giggled again, high-pitched, mean-spirited. "Don't worry," she said back. "After she sits on this for a few hours, she won't be getting up without leaving half her dignity behind." For just a fraction of a second, some part of me as a father wanted to find another explanation. I wanted to believe my only child wasn't standing there engineering the public humiliation of the woman who bore him. I stepped out of the shadows. My boots landed hard on the polished marble floor. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. My voice carried zero emotion, flat and cold as poured concrete. Sienna startled so violently she nearly dropped the bottle. She shoved it behind her back, eyes blown wide with panic. Corwin wheeled around. For just a beat, the color drained clean out of his face, but then, with a smoothness I had never witnessed in him before, he pulled himself together. He actually smiled. He stepped squarely in front of Sienna, blocking my line of sight to her hands. "Dad," he said, exhaling as if I had interrupted something perfectly ordinary. "You scared us. We were just taking care of a small issue here." I climbed the platform steps and stopped 2 ft from them. I didn't glance at Sienna. I held my son's gaze. Taking care of what issue, Corwin? I said. The cushion on Mom's chair. Corwin answered, his voice laced with manufactured concern. The velvet threading on the seat was coming loose. Sienna spotted it earlier and was just pressing it down with some clear fabric tape. You know how Mom struggles getting up and down these days. We didn't want the fabric giving way and sending her sliding off the chair. We're just looking out for her dad. We want her to have a safe day. It was a flawless lie. It sounded tender. It sounded responsible. If I had been some clueless man who had spent his career behind a desk, I might have thanked them both and walked off feeling grateful, but that was never who I was. 40 years on active construction sites had sharpened senses most people never develop. As I stood there drawing a slow breath near that table, a very specific sharp toxic chemical odor hit the back of my throat. That was not fabric tape. That was not standard craft glue. That was industrial-grade heat-curing polyurethane adhesive. We used the stuff on job sites to bond heavy materials that were never designed to separate. Exposed to the warmth of a human body, that compound cures and sets like concrete, permanently fusing any porous surface it contacts. Everything clicked into place with nauseating clarity. If Eloise sat in that chair, the $5,000 silk gown I had bought her for this occasion would literally weld itself to the velvet. They wanted her to sit through the 2-hour dinner. They wanted the adhesive to cure. Then when the music swelled and she rose to her feet, the chair would follow. The silk would be torn clean off the back of her body. She would pitch forward her protective undergarments, exposed to 300 high society guests, investors, and family members. This was not a prank. It was a calculated psychological assassination, and my son was the lookout. I stared at the dark patch soaking into the velvet. Then I brought my eyes back to Corwin. He was holding his breath, waiting to learn whether I had swallowed the story. Every instinct I had screamed at me to grab him by the collar and march him out of the building, but something deeper and colder muscled past that urge. If I blew up right now, they would simply deny it, call it an accident, a misunderstanding, and I'd be the unhinged old man who wrecked his own son's wedding. I needed to understand why they were doing this. I needed them to believe they were the sharpest minds in the room. I made my face go slack. I exhaled slowly, heavily, performing the role of the worn-out, unsuspecting father they had already decided I was. I appreciate that, son, I said, voice soft. Your mother has been so anxious about today. Knowing you two are keeping an eye on her, that means a great deal to me. Corwin's whole frame relaxed. His shoulders came down, and that arrogant curl returned to the edge of his mouth. Of course, Dad. We love her. We just want today to go perfectly. It will, I replied, turning my back on them. I'm going to go check in with the sound crew. You two go get yourselves ready. I walked away with their stares pressed against my back like a hand on my shoulder. I could nearly hear them silently toasting their narrow escape. They were convinced the trap was set and my vulnerable wife was walking straight into it. But the moment I passed back into the shadow of the hallway, the father who had loved his son all his life stepped aside, and the contractor who had built an empire from raw dirt took his place. I wasn't going to touch that chair. I was going to give them precisely the wedding they had earned. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung shut at my back, sealing away the ambient noise of the venue preparations. The corridor offered no comfort in its silence. My pulse was hammering against my ribs in a slow, weighty cadence I could feel all the way up through my jaw. I moved down the long carpeted hall, with my spine straight and my steps measured and even. Anyone who saw me would have read it as a proud father stealing a quiet moment before his only son's wedding ceremony. But beneath that surface, my entire understanding of my own family had just shattered. The chemical reek of that thick gel was still seared into my sinuses. It's a strange thing about memory. Names slip, dates fade, whole conversations dissolve, but a scent plants itself in the brain and never leaves. I didn't need to read the label on that bottle Sienna had been gripping to know exactly what it contained. That sharp, acrid, unmistakable chemical bite hanging in the air around the sweetheart table was something I had breathed in across 4 decades on commercial job sites. Industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive. You won't find it in any craft aisle. It's a heavy-duty construction compound used to fuse concrete lock steel framing and permanently marry porous materials that were never meant to part. And my son had looked me straight in the eye and called it fabric tape. I came to a stop beside a large decorative window at the end of the hall, staring out over the venue's manicured lawns. I wasn't seeing the flowers or the fountains. I was seeing Corwin's face. The sheer ease with which he had lied to my face was terrifying. No stutter, no hesitation. He had stepped squarely in front of his bride, cut off my sightline, and spun a story built entirely out of love and concern. We were just worried she might trip or slide off the chair. We want her to be safe today. He had taken his own mother's physical condition, her recent stroke, her fragility, her vulnerability, and used it as a shield to cover something vicious and deliberate. Eloise had spent the last 8 months grinding through painful physical therapy sessions just to be able to walk down that aisle on my arm. She had wept in our bedroom, terrified of looking weak in front of his new in-laws. Corwin knew every bit of that. He knew her fears. He knew about her protective undergarments. He knew every crack in her armor, and rather than standing guard over those vulnerabilities, he had handed them to Sienna like a set of tools. He had served me a plausible lie wrapped in counterfeit devotion, counting on my paternal blind spot to swallow the rest. But Corwin made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot who raised him. He forgot where the money that bought his elite education, his luxury cars, and this $300,000 wedding actually originated. It didn't come from any boardroom. It came from dust sweat and raw materials. 40 years running my commercial contracting company from bare ground up. I know precisely how polyurethane adhesive behaves under real conditions. When that gel saturates a porous surface like the velvet cushioning of a banquet chair, it doesn't pool on top. It works down into the fibers, it sinks into the threading itself, and it stays dormant until pressure and heat bring it to life. The instant a human body settles onto it, body warmth kicks the curing process into gear. Inside 30 minutes, it grows intensely tacky. Within an hour, it hardens. By the time the 2-hour dinner service concluded, that adhesive would have fused the velvet cushion, and whatever fabric lay against it, into a single immovable solid mass. It was a chemical trap precisely designed, precisely deployed, sitting there in patience for the right person to lower herself onto it. My hands curled into fists inside my jacket pockets. I could feel my fingernails biting into my palms. The calculated malice it took to engineer something like this was staggering. They had carried that bottle in from outside. This was planned well ahead of time. I stood at that window forcing myself to run the full scenario, what would have unfolded if I hadn't decided to come early to check on the sound rig. I pictured Eloise beautiful and fragile in the custom $5,000 silk gown. I'd bought her easing down into that chair. She would have smiled through the ache in her joints. She would have eaten her dinner with no idea what was curing beneath her. She would have applauded the speeches. And then the master of ceremonies would have called for the family dances. Eloise would have reached for her cane. She would have pressed down on the armrests, working her limited upper body strength, trying to rise. But nothing would have moved. The silk of her gown would have been cemented to the seat. With 300 pairs of eyes settling on her panic rising, she would have pushed harder. The delicate silk would have given zero resistance against cured polyurethane. It would have torn violently shredded away from her body, leaving the back of her dress destroyed and bonded permanently to the chair. She would have lurched forward, exposed, stripped of her dignity, humiliated in front of the city's finest. And Corwin and Sienna would have been seated right beside her, probably with phones out, recording her degradation while pretending to help her up. The image of my wife crumpled on a ballroom floor, while her son captured it for his own amusement, settled something cold and dark over my mind. The shock was gone entirely now. The grief of understanding what my son actually was had burned off, replaced by a hard, crystalline, mechanical focus. I am a builder. When I find a rotten beam in a structure, I don't mourn it. I cut it out and I put in something sound. My son had just shown me he was structurally compromised, rotten, straight through to the core. I checked my watch. There was still time. The bridal party was set to move to the outdoor gardens for pre-wedding photographs in exactly 10 minutes. The ballroom would be deserted again. I stepped away from the window and quietly opened a small utility closet near the service elevators. I stepped inside and drew the door almost shut, leaving just enough of a gap to watch the main hallway. I stood in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for the architects of that trap to leave the scene. 10 minutes later, Sienna's loud, unguarded laughter came rolling down the corridor. Through the gap, I watched her and Corwin move past, hand in hand, heading out toward the gardens to smile for the cameras. They looked happy. They looked proud of themselves. I held my position until their voices dissolved completely into the distance. Then, I eased the utility door open. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket. I walked back toward the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. It was time to run a structural inspection of my own. I needed to know exactly how far along that adhesive's curing had progressed. The torn napkin hung from my fingers, trembling slightly. I stared at the ruined fabric, my thoughts racing through the sheer scale of their cruelty. Corwin and Sienna had executed this with meticulous precision, selecting that specific velvet chair in full knowledge of what awaited my wife when she sat down. Eloise had spent the last 6 months clawing her way back from the stroke. She had endured hours of agonizing physical therapy just to be able to walk into that ballroom. She was frightened of being seen in her diminished state, yet she trusted this family completely. I had bought her a beautiful custom gown, hoping to make her feel like the queen she was today and every day after. My own son and his bride-to-be wanted to make her the spectacle of the evening. They wanted the fabric to weld to the seat. They wanted her dress to rip away when she rose for the toast. They wanted 300 high society guests to see the protective undergarments she had no choice but to wear. The revulsion curdling in my gut hardened into cold, deliberate rage. I wasn't going to remove that chair or cancel a single moment of this event. I was going to give them exactly what they had ordered, with an adjustment they would never see coming. I took out my phone and called Desmond, my trusted estate manager. He picked up on the first ring, reading the restrained urgency in my voice immediately. Desmond came through the service doors and into that ballroom within 5 minutes. I showed him the torn napkin and pointed to the velvet chair set aside for Eloise. His jaw went tight the instant he grasped what had been set up. I gave him his instructions clear and precise on what had to be done before the event got underway. We worked quickly and without a word, lifting the treated chair away from the head table with careful hands. We swapped it with the matching chair designated for Sienna, leaving the arrangement looking completely undisturbed. Then I directed Desmond to pull an identical chair from the storage room and apply the same industrial adhesive to the seat where Corwin would be sitting. The trap was now reoriented toward the people who built it. With the seating quietly rearranged, I went back to the main hallway to meet my wife. Eloise looked absolutely radiant in her flowing gown, though her hands trembled softly as she held her cane. I kissed her cheek, keeping my voice low and steady, giving her what she needed to feel calm. Corwin and Sienna swept in from their private photo session, pasting wide smiles across their faces. They hurried over to compliment Eloise, their voices thick with a sweetness so artificial it made my jaw tighten. I watched them carefully, catching the small, sidelong glances they traded when they believed I wasn't looking. They were certain their plan was running perfectly, with no inkling of the catastrophic reversal waiting to greet them in front of the entire room. The ballroom doors opened at last, and our high society guests poured in. The space filled with the clink of champagne flutes and the low murmur of polite conversation. I steered Eloise to the head table and drew out her chair with steady care. She settled into it gracefully, the silk of her gown falling smooth against the clean velvet upholstery. Corwin and Sienna took their places moments later, beaming as they pressed themselves down into their seats. I watched from the edge of my vision as they shifted and settled, driving themselves firmly against the adhesive hidden beneath them. Dinner was served without a flaw, the food and the spectacle pulling the guests' attention away from the quiet gathering storm at the very front of that room, where all of us sat together eating our meal. As the last dinner plates were cleared, the moment for the traditional evening toasts bore down fast. Corwin leaned close to me, his eyes lit with a sickening eagerness. He murmured that he and Sienna planned to be the first on their feet to honor Eloise publicly. I gave him a slow nod, keeping my face completely neutral as I handed him my blessing. The master of ceremonies tapped a spoon against his crystal glass, and the entire room folded into silence. Corwin and Sienna seized their microphones, turning brilliant smiles toward the crowd. They planted to their feet and pushed up from their velvet chairs, preparing to address the assembled guests in that grand, beautiful ballroom space. They did not rise gracefully. What came instead was a sound of tearing fabric that rang out across the dead, quiet room. Corwin gasped as his custom-tailored trousers split open, baring his skin and brightly colored underwear to the stunned crowd. Sienna shrieked in pure horror as the expensive fabric of her designer dress shredded apart, leaving her exposed and humiliated in front of her wealthy guests. They stumbled and clutched at the remnants of their ruined clothing, while the chairs clung stubbornly to their bodies for several agonizing seconds. A wave of disbelieving gasps rolled through the room, followed by scattered murmurs and barely suppressed laughter. I sat quietly beside my wife and watched the justice I had so carefully arranged unfold exactly as intended. Corwin went a deep burning crimson, his eyes raking frantically around the room as the spectacular failure of his scheme registered on his face. Sienna dissolved into dramatic tears, trying to disappear behind the floral centerpiece, while shooting furious glances at the catering staff nearby. Eloise turned to me, with wide, bewildered eyes, completely unaware that this degrading fate had originally been designed for her. I gently took her hand and gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze before rising from my own perfectly ordinary velvet chair. The room stilled as I took the microphone. It was time to drag the ugly truth out from beneath their shallow, hollow, cruel social performance and lay it bare for everyone present. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice carrying clean and steady across the ballroom. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate this union. I let the silence sit for a moment, uncomfortable and stretching, while Corwin and Sienna hunched in their tattered garments. However, I continued. Certain individuals chose to use this occasion to engineer a deeply disturbing trap aimed at humiliating my wife. Murmurs of outrage moved through the room as comprehension settled over the guests' faces. They coated a chair with industrial adhesive, intending to mock her medical condition for their own amusement. Corwin shook his head in frantic denial, whispering protests that not a single person in that room was inclined to believe. Fortunately, I uncovered their trap earlier today and quietly rearranged the seating accordingly. The collective intake of breath from the audience was deeply satisfying to witness firsthand. I turned my gaze back to my son, letting my expression harden to cold steel. You thought you could strip her of her dignity, but all you managed to strip away was any illusion of your own decency. I reached into my suit jacket and drew out a folded stack of legal documents. This goes well beyond a cruel and childish prank, I announced. I have spent the past several hours going through the company's financial records. Corwin went pale, his humiliation instantly swallowed by something closer to terror. I am aware of the offshore accounts and the forged signatures, I said plainly. You are cut off, disinherited, and there are authorities waiting for you in the lobby as we speak. I walked back into the grand ballroom, pulling the heavy oak doors shut softly behind me. The space was stunning. Thousands of cream peonies and crystal centerpieces covering every surface, a scene of polished elegance paid for by decades of my labor. But as I moved toward the raised platform where the head table stood, all I could register was the rot concealed beneath the beauty. I stopped in front of the two velvet chairs. Outwardly, they were identical in every way: the same carved mahogany legs, the same curved backrests, the same plush velvet cushions. The only thing setting them apart was the small gold-plated name tag in front of each seat. One read Eloise, the other read Sienna. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the compact multi-tool I carried every day. A man who has lived on construction sites does not go anywhere without something useful on his person. I crouched beside my wife's assigned chair and felt for the 4 steel bolts securing the velvet cushion to the frame. Standard hexagonal screws, nothing a seasoned contractor couldn't manage with pressure and leverage. I worked the flat edge of the tool into the first bolt and applied steady torque until the metal yielded with a quiet click. Inside 2 minutes, I had completely freed the velvet cushion, soaked through with the curing polyurethane adhesive. I lifted the contaminated cushion clear of the wooden frame, keeping my hands away from the treated fabric. I set it down carefully on the carpet. Then I moved to the identical chair designated for my future daughter-in-law. I crouched and ran through the same process, backing out the 4 bolts holding Sienna's clean cushion in place. I lifted her untreated cushion and brought it over to Eloise's chair frame. I lined up the bolt holes, slid the fasteners back through, and torqued them down with the tool edge until the seat held solid. My wife would now be sitting on a perfectly clean cushion, comfortable, safe, untouched by the trap her own son had helped prepare for her. I carried the adhesive-soaked cushion to the bride's chair frame and bolted it firmly into position. Sienna's seat was now the snare. She would be settling onto the exact chemical trap she had gleefully set for a woman still rebuilding herself after a stroke. I stood closed the multi-tool and pocketed it. The chairs looked completely undisturbed. Nobody would suspect a thing. But as I stood there studying the swapped seats, a cold and gnawing thought surfaced. The immediate danger to my wife had been neutralized, but the deeper threat beneath all of this remained entirely unresolved. I uncrossed my arms and looked out at the empty ballroom. People of sound mind do not engineer acts of extreme calculated cruelty for a cheap laugh. There is always a darker, heavier motive at work behind this kind of behavior. Corwin was arrogant, certainly, but he was also fiercely protective of his public image. He would never risk detonating a scandal at his own highly publicized, expensive wedding, unless there was a significant prize waiting at the end of it. So, why did they want to humiliate Eloise this badly? Why expose her medical vulnerabilities to 300 of the most influential people in the city? What could they possibly stand to gain from parading her weakness in front of our investors, our colleagues, our friends? The answer landed on me, like a beam dropping from a scaffold. They needed an audience. They needed witnesses. They wanted every person in our professional and social world to watch my wife collapse, to see her lose control, to mark her as diminished and broken. This was never a prank. This was a stage production, and they needed the documentation to make the narrative hold. If they were moving on something that large, I needed real evidence. I needed their intentions captured on record. I turned on my heel and walked out of the ballroom at a measured pace, threading through the back corridors until I reached the service exit. I pushed through the heavy metal door and stepped out into the warm afternoon light. I moved quickly across the parking lot toward my pickup truck. I unlocked the door, climbed in, and opened the center console. Resting there beside my measuring tapes and rolled blueprints was my ruggedized field audio recorder, a solid, heavy piece of equipment I relied on to capture verbal contracts, supply orders, and job site disputes above the roar of heavy machinery. It had a highly sensitive microphone and a battery life that could easily last for 36 straight hours. I took the recorder and grabbed a fresh roll of industrial black gaffer tape from the glove compartment. I locked the truck and moved back toward the venue, slipping in through the service doors while the catering crew was occupied, hauling in crates of champagne. I went straight back to the grand ballroom and walked directly up to the sweetheart table. The table was skirted in thick cascading white linen that fell all the way to the floor, offering perfect concealment. I got down and crawled underneath, finding myself in a dim, tight space directly below where Corwin and Sienna would be seated all evening. I powered on the field audio recorder and confirmed the small red indicator light was pulsing steadily. I tore off 3 long strips of industrial black gaffer tape. I pressed the recorder hard against the wooden underside of the table and secured it firmly, making sure nothing would shift or rattle during the dinner service. The microphone sat perfectly positioned, just inches from where their laps would rest. It would capture every murmured word, every malicious laugh, every dirty secret they traded, while they waited anxiously for the adhesive to do its work. I backed out from under the table and brushed the dust from the knees of my trousers. I stood alone at the center of that magnificent room, staring at the hidden apparatus I had just put in place. The physical danger to my wife was neutralized and the audio was running, but a sharp instinct, the kind forged across 70 years of navigating cutthroat business and fatherhood, told me I was still missing a critical piece of the picture. A recording would catch their reactions and their whispered conversations during the reception, but it wouldn't expose the foundational architecture of their entire scheme. I needed to understand exactly how they planned to use Eloise's public humiliation. I needed to see the full end game. People who conspire together always leave a digital trail of their ambitions. They text, they email, they commit their greed to writing. I looked toward the grand staircase leading up to the private bridal suite on the second floor. Corwin and Sienna were outside in the gardens at that very moment, posing for lengthy professional photographs, blithely leaving their personal belongings completely unguarded in their dressing rooms. My son was confident, entitled, and dangerously careless. It was time to turn that carelessness against him. I left the grand ballroom and made my way toward the sweeping marble staircase at the far end of the venue foyer. The catering crew was moving fast, streaming in and out of the kitchen doors. Not one of them gave a second glance to the older man in the tailored suit climbing to the second floor. The upper level housed the private bridal suites. I moved down the carpeted hallway past a row of closed doors until I found the one bearing a small brass plaque that read, "Groom." I pushed the heavy door open and stepped in. The room told me everything I needed to know about my son. It reeked of expensive cologne and spilled dark liquor. Empty crystal tumblers littered the mahogany coffee table, surrounded by crumpled garment bags. It was the wreckage of arrogant celebration. I closed the door behind me and made sure the lock engaged. My eyes swept the room, skipping past the leather sofas and settling on a sleek glass desk near the window. Sitting squarely in the center of the desk, entirely unattended, was Corwin's silver tablet. I crossed to the desk and looked down at the screen. My pulse beat with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I reached out and tapped the glass. The screen bloomed to life, showing a smiling photograph of Corwin and Sienna. Beneath their faces was a 4-digit keypad. Corwin never changed his passwords unless someone forced him to. I entered his birth year. The screen rejected it. I tried Sienna's birth year. Another rejection. I held still and let out a slow breath. I typed in my wife's birth year. The screen opened immediately. A wave of bitter irony rolled through me as the home screen loaded. He had secured the very device he was using to plot his mother's destruction with her own birth year. He took everything from us, our history, our milestones, and converted it to his own private use. I had no time to sit with that. There was work to be done. I skipped past his banking folders and went straight to the messaging application, pulling up his private conversations. Sienna's name sat pinned at the top of the list. I opened their thread, a dense rolling archive of daily exchanges. I wasn't interested in wedding logistics. I tapped the search bar and entered Eloise's name. The screen paused, then lit up with dozens of flagged messages. I scrolled back to a conversation from 3 weeks earlier, right around the time the seating chart had been locked in. I began reading their private words, and whatever paternal warmth I still held for my son drained out of me completely. They did not speak of my wife as a person. They spoke of her the way you speak of an obstacle. Sienna complained at length about how Eloise's mobility aid would compromise the aesthetic of the wedding photographs. Corwin agreed, griping about the cost of accessible transport. As I scrolled toward the present, the tone shifted from petty irritation into something colder and more deliberate. A cluster of messages from 2 days ago came into view. Sienna had sent a link to an industrial supply website featuring the heavy-duty polyurethane adhesive. Under the link, a single line: "I bought it. It arrives tomorrow." I held my thumb still as I read Corwin's reply. He did not tell her to stop. He wrote, "Perfect. Make sure you pack it so the old man does not see it." I steadied myself against the edge of the desk. I scrolled down to the exchange they had late the previous night. What I read there turned my blood to ice. Sienna had started it. "I am so nervous about tomorrow," she wrote. "What if she realizes the cushion is wet before she sits down?" Corwin came back instantly. "She will not notice anything. Her legs are so numb from the nerve damage she can barely feel where she sits anyway." I stared at those words and felt something physical move through my chest. My son was using his own mother's medical suffering as a tactical asset. What came next revealed a darkness I had not seen coming. Sienna wrote, "Okay, but you have to promise me you will have your phone ready to record. Once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you get the whole meltdown on video. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and your dad's investors is exactly what we need to prove our point." I read it again. What point? I pulled up Corwin's lengthy reply. "I know," he had written. "Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam dunk case for a conservatorship." The air in that suite went thin. A conservatorship. They were plotting a legal takeover. I steadied my eyes on the screen. "We force him to hand over the trust to me now," Corwin had typed. "I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. Once Mom is declared a ward of the state, we can move her into a facility and take over the estate. This is our only way to get the money, without waiting for nature to take its course." I set the tablet down on the glass desk and drew my hands back from it as if the surface had burned me. The scale of their calculated betrayal was beyond anything I could have constructed in my worst imagination. They were working to manufacture a public medical crisis to humiliate Eloise so completely and so visibly that I would be left shattered, clearing the way for them to seize the financial empire I had spent 4 grinding decades building from nothing. I stood alone in that quiet room, listening to the muffled sounds of wedding preparations drifting up from downstairs. He had looked at my wife's devastating illness not as a family tragedy, but as a legal mechanism to exploit. Every smile, every embrace, every expression of gratitude he had ever shown me had been a calibrated performance designed to keep me docile, while he quietly sharpened the blade he intended to drive into my back. I looked at the glowing screen one final time, burning every one of those words into my memory. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. Men who survive in commercial contracting don't spend themselves on emotional outbursts. We survey the damage, reinforce what must hold, and tear out the compromised sections without hesitation. Corwin believed he was running a brilliant game against a weak and oblivious old man. He believed he'd accounted for every possible variable in securing his inheritance today. What he forgot completely was that I owned the board, the pieces, and the rulebook. I lifted the tablet again, my hands perfectly steady, and moved swiftly past the messages into his main email application. I needed to understand just how deep this financial corruption ran before I reduced his entire treacherous world to ash. The email app's bright screen lit up the dim bridal suite, throwing long shadows across the walls. My finger hovered above the keyboard. The text messages I'd just read still burned behind my eyes, branding themselves into my memory. I needed to see the operational skeleton of their betrayal. A legal coup of this scale doesn't materialize overnight. It demands planning documentation and the willing participation of an attorney comfortable working in the law's gray margins. I tapped the search bar and typed the word conservatorship. The system paused for half a heartbeat before a long column of email threads filled the screen. The sheer volume of results turned my stomach. This wasn't a passing impulse or a fleeting temptation. This was a deliberate, long-running operation. I opened the most recent thread dated just 3 days ago. It was addressed to a private attorney I didn't recognize, someone working out of a boutique law firm downtown. The subject line read, "Final medical strategy and venue preparation." I drew a slow, steadying breath and read the cold, clinical language my son had chosen to describe the woman who had raised him, shielded him, and loved him without condition for his entire life. Corwin Beckett had constructed a completely fabricated narrative regarding the recovery of Eloise Beckett from her stroke. Paragraph after paragraph painted her as hopelessly disoriented, physically in decline, and wholly incapable of meeting her own basic needs. He deliberately recast her moments of tiredness as episodes of serious cognitive failure. He described me as a stubborn, grieving husband drowning in denial about his wife's mental state, increasingly erratic, increasingly unhinged. Attached to the email was a file containing the most private medical records belonging to Eloise. Corwin had somehow extracted her charts, her physical therapy evaluations, and her prescription records without our knowledge. He was assembling a comprehensive dossier designed to strip us of our most fundamental rights. I scrolled to the attorney's reply. The lawyer advised Corwin that while the medical records were useful, judges in our state typically hesitated to grant full conservatorship without a documented public incident demonstrating that the parents posed a danger to themselves or a disturbance to others. The lawyer specifically asked for concrete, irrefutable visual evidence of Eloise's supposed incompetence and my failure to manage her condition. My son had responded with a chilling guarantee. He told the attorney to have the final petition drafted and ready to file Monday morning. He promised that the required public incident would unfold that very weekend. He wrote that the whole city would witness our collapse. I scrolled further down the chain, my vision blurring slightly at the raw malice radiating off the screen. Corwin had forwarded the attorney a series of attached image files. I tapped the first one. The screen expanded to reveal a screenshot of a text exchange between him and Sienna, the exact conversation they had had late the previous night, captured and preserved as strategic evidence for their lawyer. Seeing those words framed in a legal context made them infinitely more sickening. Sienna, once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you record the meltdown. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and the investors of your father is exactly what we need. I stared at her words, processing the cold, predatory calculation behind them. She didn't merely want to humiliate her mother-in-law. She wanted to engineer a spectacle so degrading it would break Eloise permanently. Then I read Corwin's reply, preserved there in the screenshot. I know. Combine that video with her stroke medical records and my lawyer says, we have a slam-dunk case for a conservatorship. We declare Mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation, he will not fight it. We forced him to hand over the Beckett Trust to me. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. I read that final sentence again and again until the words dissolved into meaningless shapes on a glowing screen. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. That was the true core of everything. It was never about concern for Eloise's health. It was never about managing a family in crisis. It was solely about the Beckett Trust. I had built that trust 15 years ago, pouring every dollar of hard-earned wealth into a secure financial structure meant to protect my family across generations. It was designed to fund Eloise's medical care, to secure Corwin's future, and to support the charitable causes we held close. Corwin was the sole heir, but the trust was structured so that he wouldn't gain full unrestricted access to the principal until he turned 50, or until both Eloise and I were gone. He didn't want to wait for his inheritance. He wanted the keys to the kingdom right now, and he was entirely willing to destroy his own parents to take them. The depth of this betrayal was a bottomless abyss. He wasn't simply stealing money. He was trying to legally erase our autonomy. A conservatorship would mean we couldn't direct our own medical care. We couldn't control our own accounts. We couldn't even choose where we slept at night. Corwin would hold absolute power to sell our home, dismiss Eloise as trusted physicians, and place us in whatever facility he saw fit. He would reign over our lives with the exact cruelty he and Sienna had already put on display. I set the tablet back on the desk, making certain it rested precisely where I'd found it. The cold focus that had carried me through this ballroom returned, sweeping away every last trace of a father's grief. I stood at the edge of a battlefield, and the enemy bore my name. They had built a weapon to execute a flawless legal coup, using my wife's tragedy as their primary ammunition. But every complex scheme needs financing, especially one that involves retaining downtown law firms and hosting a $300,000 wedding. Their ambition demanded substantial hidden cash. They couldn't fund this operation on their personal income alone. I needed to know exactly how Corwin was covering these costs. For the past 6 months, Sienna had been loudly telling anyone who'd listen that her wealthy family was generously bankrolling this extravagant reception. I reached out and tapped the screen once more, closing the sickening email thread with the estate attorney. I navigated back to the main inbox, eyes narrowing with sharp concentration. I drew one deep, steadying breath to brace myself. The truth was waiting for me right there on the screen. I tapped the search bar again, but this time the word I typed wasn't conservatorship. I typed in the names of the wedding vendors, the florists, the caterers, the venue management. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to expose his financial crimes without a shred of mercy. The results came up instantly, flooding the screen with dozens of high-priority threads. I started with the floral company, responsible for the thousands of delicate cream peonies and crystal centerpieces gracing the ballroom downstairs. Sienna had spent the last 6 months loudly boasting at every social event we attended that her supposedly affluent parents were covering the entire bill for this $300,000 extravaganza. I tapped the first email and opened a detailed digital invoice for $55,000. I skipped past the itemized breakdown and scrolled straight to the billing information. My eyes landed on the payment routing details, and the nauseating reality hit me like a physical blow. The invoice was not billed to Sienna's parents. It was not billed to any personal account connected to her family. The payment was billed directly to Beckett Commercial Contracting, my company. I closed the floral invoice and opened the billing thread for the luxury catering service. The total for the gourmet dinner and open bar came to $84,000. I scrolled to the bottom of the page. Again, the invoice was billed straight to my commercial construction company. I pulled up the receipts for the venue rental, the live jazz band, and the custom wedding cake. Every single major expense tied to this lavish wedding was being systematically drained from my corporate operational accounts. I dropped heavily into the leather chair behind the glass desk, a cold and unfamiliar numbness spreading through my chest. Corwin held the title of Vice President of Regional Operations at my company. I had given him that position because I genuinely believed he was ready to shoulder the responsibility of overseeing our large-scale commercial developments. I had extended him high-level clearance to authorize material purchases and manage budgets across our active construction sites. He had taken that profound professional trust and turned it into a vehicle for massive coordinated theft. I needed to understand precisely how he was concealing these extravagant luxury expenses from my accounting department. I navigated out of his personal inbox and logged directly into his corporate email, pulling up his approved project budgets for the current fiscal quarter. The sheer audacity of what I found was breathtaking. Corwin had officially registered a completely fabricated commercial project inside our corporate system. He had built a fraudulent portfolio for a large industrial warehouse development, supposedly situated on the far west side of the city. He was channeling every luxury wedding expense through this phantom project by deliberately mislabeling vendor invoices as standard construction costs. The $55,000 floral bill was entered in our ledger as heavy-duty soil stabilization and commercial landscaping. The $84,000 catering invoice was fraudulently classified as long-term rentals for specialized excavation machinery. He had even managed to expense the $18,000 custom silk and lace wedding gown Sienna was wearing downstairs by coding it as high-grade industrial steel scaffolding. He was mocking me. He was mocking the company I had bled 4 decades of my life to build. The truth about Sienna's family was now impossible to ignore. They were not wealthy socialites from old money. They were flat-broke, pathetic frauds projecting an image of extreme wealth without a single dollar to back it up. Corwin was so desperate to impress this manipulative woman and her pretentious parents that he was willing to commit serious corporate fraud just to purchase their admiration. He was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my business to bankroll a fabricated lifestyle for a woman who was actively scheming to destroy his own mother's life. He was literally funding the very event where they intended to publicly humiliate my disabled wife. This was no longer simply a heartbreaking tale of a deeply ungrateful son exploiting his wealthy father. This was not a family disagreement over a spoiled child helping himself to money without asking. This was a deliberate, calculated, and highly organized financial crime. Corwin was committing felony embezzlement on a massive corporate scale. By funneling these bogus invoices through my business, he was artificially inflating our operational expenses, which hit our corporate tax filings directly. He was placing my entire contracting empire at serious risk of federal tax evasion charges, steep financial penalties, and potentially ruinous government audits. He was actively threatening the livelihoods of the 300 hard-working men and women who depended on my company to feed their families every single week. I thought about the loyal foremen, the dedicated bricklayers, and the worn-down project managers who put in 12-hour days to make sure our builds came in on time and on spec. They had poured themselves into building a name for Beckett Commercial Contracting. Corwin was sitting in a climate-controlled office, casually signing away their hard-earned profits to cover imported champagne and out-of-season flowers. The contempt he showed for the very foundation of our family's wealth was beyond forgiveness. I stared at the glowing tablet screen as the digital record of his felony crimes stared right back at me. Whatever faint trace of paternal hesitation remained, whatever last fragile hope that my son might still be reachable, evaporated into the cool air of the bridal suite. When you build structures for a living, you learn fast that you cannot compromise with a cracked foundation. You cannot negotiate with rot. If you try to patch over a fundamental structural failure, the whole building will come down eventually. Corwin was a catastrophic structural failure. He was a liability that threatened to bring down everything I had built and everyone I cared about. The gloves were off. I was no longer functioning as a wounded father, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. I was operating as the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar corporation who had just discovered a rat gnawing through the main power lines of his business. I closed the corporate email application and locked the silver tablet, making certain I placed it precisely where I'd found it. I had no need to take the device with me. The fraudulent invoices, the fabricated project budgets, and the deeply incriminating correspondence with the estate lawyer were all permanently stored on the secure corporate servers. I already had every piece of evidence I would ever need to dismantle his world completely. I rose from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket with unhurried, steady hands. The quiet observation phase was over. It was time to move into demolition. I turned from the desk and walked toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. The muffled sound of the jazz band drifted up faintly through the floorboards from the grand ballroom below. The unsuspecting guests were down there enjoying the expensive cocktails and lavish appetizers that my stolen money had paid for, celebrating the union of two people who embodied the very worst of human nature. I closed my hand around the brass doorknob and felt a sharp, clarifying calm settle over me. I knew exactly what came next. I needed to call in my demolition crew. I eased the heavy wooden door shut behind me, listening for the soft click of the latch. The thick hallway carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps as I moved away from the room that held the digital proof of my son's ultimate betrayal. I did not take the grand marble staircase back down to the main foyer where the oblivious guests were mingling. Instead, I bypassed the ornate elevators and shouldered open a heavy fire door into the venue's emergency stairwell. The air in there was nothing like the perfumed corridors outside. It was cool and stale and utterly silent, carrying the faint smell of concrete and industrial floor cleaner, the smell of an unfinished job site. I descended half a flight and stopped on the concrete landing, completely cut off from the celebration, echoing through the rest of the building. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I didn't need to search my contacts. I dialed my corporate attorney's private cell number from memory. Gerald was not just a lawyer. He was a highly aggressive, deeply strategic legal shark who had spent the last 20 years protecting my commercial contracting empire from predatory competitors and fraudulent subcontractors. He was precisely the kind of man you want beside you when it's time to tear a compromised structure down to bare studs. The line rang twice before he picked up. Gerald never fully unplugged on weekends. His sharp, gravelly voice came through the speaker with the familiar cadence of a man perpetually braced for a corporate emergency. He answered by asking whether there was a problem with the venue contracts I'd signed for the wedding. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall and stared down at the empty steps below me. I told him the venue was fine, but that we had a catastrophic internal breach inside the company that demanded his immediate and ruthless attention. I heard the distinct sound of a chair rolling backward on hardwood as Gerald gave me his full focus. I didn't ease into it or soften any of the painful details. I spoke in the flat, controlled tone of a chief executive delivering a terminal damage report. I told him that my son, his regional vice president of operations, had actively conspired to commit a massive corporate fraud. I walked him through how Corwin had secretly created a completely fabricated industrial warehouse project inside our corporate accounting system to systematically embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars. I explained that the money was being illegally diverted to finance the lavish wedding taking place on the other side of that fire door at that very moment. Gerald went completely silent for several seconds, absorbing the scope of the legal exposure Corwin had so recklessly created for my company. When he finally spoke, there was a cold, metallic edge in his voice that told me he had already shifted into full demolition mode. He asked me what I wanted done. I gave him his orders with precise, unambiguous clarity. I instructed Gerald to contact our primary corporate banking representatives immediately. I directed him to freeze every joint operational account that Corwin held any level of authorized access to. I told him to completely sever my son's digital presence from the company's servers and permanently strip him of all administrative access. I wanted every high-limit corporate credit card in his name canceled before the evening ended, reduced to useless rectangles of plastic by the time he reached for them. But that was only the opening move of the financial execution. I drew a slow, measured breath, pulling the stale stairwell air into my lungs before issuing the most critical directive of all. I told Gerald to immediately pull up the master file for the Beckett Trust. I instructed him to prepare the necessary emergency paperwork to fully and permanently remove my son's status as sole beneficiary of my estate. I walked Gerald through the horrifying medical conservatorship scheme I had uncovered on the tablet upstairs. I laid out how Corwin and his new bride had actively conspired to weaponize Eloise's recent stroke to have us both declared mentally incompetent. Gerald let out a low, disgusted breath. In all our years of fighting ruthless corporate adversaries, he told me he had never encountered a betrayal so intimately evil. I directed him to build an impenetrable legal firewall around Eloise and me. I wanted the trust restructured so tightly that my son could never touch a single dollar of our wealth, even if we were both incapacitated. I told him to redirect the inheritance entirely to charitable foundations and targeted medical research grants dedicated to stroke recovery. Corwin had tried to use his mother's illness to steal a fortune. That same fortune would now go toward funding the cure for her condition. It was the purest, most undeniable form of poetic justice. I instructed Gerald to have the preliminary trust revocation documents drafted, finalized, and waiting for my signature first thing Monday morning. But cutting off his access to future wealth was not enough on its own. A crime had been committed against my company, against my employees, and against the integrity of everything I had built over the last 40 years. I gave Gerald the final and most devastating instruction of all. I told him to formally compile every piece of evidence surrounding the fake warehouse project, the doctored vendor invoices, and the stolen $300,000. I directed him to draft a comprehensive criminal complaint for felony embezzlement. Gerald asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to pursue criminal charges against my own flesh and blood. He cautioned me that once that file was submitted to the Financial Crimes Division of the local authorities, there was no pulling it back. The state would take control of the prosecution, and my son would face serious mandatory prison time. I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. I fixed my eyes on the heavy metal hinges of the fire door and told my attorney that the man downstairs was no longer my son. He was a thief, a liability, and a dangerous predator who had attempted to destroy my wife. I wanted the criminal embezzlement file completed and officially delivered to the police department the moment their precinct doors opened Monday morning. Gerald agreed without another word of pushback. He promised that the entire financial execution would be prepared and ready to deploy before the weekend was out. I thanked him for decades of unwavering loyalty and ended the call. I slid the phone back into the breast pocket of my jacket. The trap was fully set. The legal guillotine hung suspended in the air, waiting for the rope to be cut. All I had to do now was endure the remaining hours of the wedding reception. I pushed the heavy stairwell door open and stepped back into the bright, opulent corridor of the luxury wedding venue. I straightened my tie, squared my posture, and walked toward the grand ballroom to watch the magnificent unraveling of the people who had tried to ruin my family. They believed they could plunder my empire while making a cruel spectacle of my wife. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the true price of absolute betrayal. The formal ceremony was held in the glass-enclosed conservatory, just across the immaculate courtyard. I stood in the back row and watched the entire charade play out with a perfectly composed smile fixed on my face. Corwin and Sienna recited their handwritten vows beneath a canopy of imported ivory gardenias, speaking of unwavering loyalty, eternal devotion, and building a foundation of absolute trust. It took every measure of discipline I had developed over 40 years in commercial construction to stop myself from laughing outright. The hypocrisy of their words was physically nauseating. They slid the rose gold rings onto each other's fingers, kissed for the cheering crowd, and walked back down the aisle to thunderous applause. I clapped along with the rest of the 300 oblivious guests. Not one person in that sunlit room had any idea they were applauding a pair of calculating corporate embezzlers. They had no notion they were celebrating a couple who had actively schemed to emotionally obliterate the fragile woman currently gripping my left arm. As the classical piano trio played its final piece, the great crowd began a slow, elegant drift toward the grand ballroom for the evening reception. I guided Eloise through the busy courtyard, keeping my pace unhurried and deliberate to match her limited mobility. She leaned into her polished wooden cane, her breath coming in shallow, tired increments. The physical toll of the long ceremony was visible in her face, though she hid her discomfort behind a warm and gracious smile. Guests stepped into our path every few strides to offer their hollow congratulations and marvel at the extravagance of the event. I nodded and thanked them quietly, tallying in my mind the stolen funds that surrounded us on every side. I looked at the towering floral arrangements flanking the ballroom entrance. I looked at the liveried staff gliding past, with silver trays of expensive vintage champagne. I looked at the custom ice sculptures softening slowly beneath the ambient lights. My money had purchased every single piece of this manufactured fairy tale. Corwin had drained the lifeblood of my contracting empire to erect a monument to his own outsized ego. But the hour of reckoning was drawing very close now. We stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the magnificent grand ballroom. The room was a breathtaking display of opulent luxury, bathed in the warm, soft glow of the $18,000 sound system I had personally financed just months before. The 300 guests quickly located their assigned tables, the room swelling with a low roar of elite social chatter and clinking crystal. I tuned it all out and focused entirely on the woman walking beside me. I steered Eloise straight toward the raised platform at the front of the room. The sweetheart table sat at the center, flanked by immediate family seating on both sides. I moved to the velvet cushion chair, bearing her gold-plated name card. My heart held a cold, steady rhythm as I drew back the heavy mahogany frame for her. I knew with complete certainty that this particular cushion was perfectly clean, carefully swapped by my own hands just hours before. Eloise turned slowly, gripping the sturdy armrests for balance. She lowered herself gracefully onto the plush velvet, letting out a quiet, relieved sigh as the soft fabric took the weight from her aching back. I straightened the flowing train of her beautiful $5,000 custom silk gown, making sure the delicate fabric fell perfectly around her legs. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder and leaned in to tell her she looked absolutely stunning tonight. She reached up and covered my rough, calloused hand with her own, her eyes bright with real gratitude. She felt completely safe in that chair, entirely unaware of the chemical nightmare that had originally been intended for her. The lively jazz band stationed in the corner of the ballroom shifted into an upbeat driving melody. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, his voice cutting through the ambient roar of the room. He invited the 300 seated guests to rise and welcome the new husband and wife. The grand double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a sweep of drama. Corwin and Sienna made their grand entrance, stepping into the spotlight to a wave of deafening applause and cheering. Sienna looked like a flawless magazine cover, beaming triumphantly as she waved to the crowd. She wore a breathtaking custom-fitted Vera Wang bridal gown of the finest imported Chantilly lace and cascading silk tulle. An $18,000 masterpiece of high fashion, and every thread of it had been paid for by the fraudulent warehouse invoices Corwin had buried inside my corporate accounting ledgers. She was literally dressed in the tangible evidence of my son's felony embezzlement. They crossed the polished marble dance floor with confident ease, basking in the stolen luxury, enveloping them on all sides. They climbed to the raised platform, offered one final wave to the cheering room, and turned to take their seats at the sweetheart table. I settled into my assigned chair directly to Eloise's right, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression perfectly serene. I watched closely as Sienna moved toward her designated seat, the chair with the matching velvet cushion, the chair soaked deep into its core with industrial-grade, heat-curing polyurethane adhesive. She gathered the sides of her heavy, voluminous Vera Wang gown, lifting the delicate layers of expensive lace clear of the floor to avoid tripping. She flashed a radiant smile at the designated wedding videographer positioned nearby, completely unaware of the ruggedized field audio recorder quietly capturing every word from directly beneath her. With a smooth, practiced movement, she settled herself down, her full body weight pressed firmly into the thick velvet cushion. The trap was sprung. The chemical snare had claimed its intended prey. The moment she sank into the seat, the mask of the glowing, jubilant bride slipped for just a fraction of a second. Sienna tilted her head slightly, her eyes snapping directly to Eloise. It was a venomous, predatory, deeply expectant glare, the look of a butcher sizing up a lamb, counting down to the inevitable. She was mentally tallying the minutes until her vicious little spectacle would finally play out. Then Sienna shifted her gaze away from Eloise and settled it on me. She expected to find a tired, oblivious old man contentedly enjoying his son's wedding. Instead, she found me already staring back, my eyes as cold and unyielding as broken glass. I did not look away. I held her gaze with a quiet, terrifying stillness. I reached out unhurriedly and lifted my crystal flute of vintage champagne. I raised it smoothly in her direction, a silent glacial toast. A brief flicker of genuine confusion crossed her perfectly contoured face. She couldn't make sense of why I was looking at her as though she were already a ghost. She broke eye contact, quickly turned back to smile at the room, and settled her weight deeper into the toxic velvet cushion. The countdown had officially begun. She had no idea that every minute she sat there smiling and sipping my stolen champagne, the chemical compound was steadily sealing her spectacular ruin. The grand illusion of their perfect, untouchable life was about to come apart violently into 1,000 pieces. The first course of the lavish dinner arrived with flawless precision, a fleet of waiters in crisp white jackets moving through the grand ballroom like a well-drilled crew. They set plates of shaved Wagyu beef and pan-seared lobster medallions before the 300 distinguished guests. I looked down at the expensive appetizer resting on the gold-rimmed china in front of me. A culinary masterpiece, every bite of it funded by the fraudulent warehouse invoices Corwin had buried in my corporate ledgers. I picked up my silver fork and ate slowly, savoring the bitter irony with each deliberate chew. Across the large circular table, Sienna was laughing loudly at something one of her bridesmaids had said. She leaned back heavily into her chair, pressing the layered skirt of her $18,000 Vera Wang gown snugly into the plush velvet cushion beneath her. She had absolutely no idea that a silent, invisible chemical reaction had already taken hold directly beneath her. Industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive is a formidable compound. It is engineered to endure extreme weather-heavy machinery vibration and the brutal punishment of active commercial construction environments. But its most dangerous quality is the way it cures. It needs a catalyst to convert from a thick, tacky gel into an immovable mass as solid as concrete. That catalyst is heat. As Sienna sat there enjoying her stolen luxury, the warmth radiating naturally from her body filtered down through the delicate silk tulle and chantilly lace of her expensive gown. That heat seeped into the velvet cushion, waking the dormant adhesive I had positioned beneath her designated seat. I watched her lift her champagne glass and shift her weight slightly to the left. The microscopic fibers of her designer gown were already fusing permanently with the thick curing gel. An hour passed slowly. The second course of prime ribeye and charred broccolini was cleared away, replaced by towering silver trays of artisan desserts. I kept up polite conversation with the wealthy investors seated at the adjacent tables, projecting the image of a proud and unhurried patriarch. Beside me, Eloise was genuinely enjoying her evening. She admired the floral arrangements and smiled warmly at the jazz band playing softly in the corner of the room. She looked beautiful, and more than that, she was completely safe. I glanced back at the sweetheart table. The curing process was entering its final, most aggressive phase. The adhesive was no longer a tacky gel. It was hardening fast, bonding the fabric of the dress to the chair with the grip of industrial mortar. I noticed Sienna starting to shift uncomfortably in her seat. She reached behind her back, tugging quietly at the fabric at her waist. She leaned close and whispered something into my son's ear, her face drawn into a tight expression of mild irritation. She could feel the strange binding tension of the adhesive, but her vanity blinded her to what it actually was. She almost certainly assumed the rigid custom boning of her high-fashion corset was simply pressing into her ribs after a heavy meal. She tried to slide her hips forward to relieve the odd resistance, but her body barely budged. The fabric was already anchored firmly to the seat. She frowned, rolling her shoulders forward to adjust her posture, unknowingly grinding the lower half of her gown even deeper into the hardening chemical trap. I took another slow, measured sip of champagne and watched the jaws of the trap lock shut. The ambient hum of the grand ballroom began to quiet as the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. He tapped his crystal glass to signal the formal close of the dinner service. The hour for the traditional wedding speeches had arrived. A respectful hush fell over the room. Corwin pushed back his chair and stood. He took the wireless microphone and moved to the front of the raised platform with polished confidence. He surveyed the sea of 300 elite guests, radiating an aura of authority and responsible maturity. He was a gifted actor, a man capable of lying with such genuine conviction that watching him do it in person genuinely unsettled me. He opened his speech by thanking the guests for making the journey from across the country to mark this milestone in his life. He spoke of the challenges that come with building a future, the dignity of hard work, and the necessity of a solid foundation. Then Corwin turned and looked directly at our table. He locked eyes with me, steady, unwavering, charged with a dark, predatory confidence. He raised his glass toward Eloise and me. He said he wanted to take a special moment to honor his parents, his voice carrying clearly through the grand ballroom. He said they had shown him what it means to endure the hardest storms life can bring. He told the room that the family had recently faced a terrifying medical challenge, that his mother had suffered a stroke, and that it had reminded all of them just how fragile life truly is. He paused with practiced timing, letting the guests murmur in sympathetic agreement. He looked at Eloise with a sickening expression of manufactured sorrow. Then his eyes cut back to mine. He said it had taught him that the most sacred duty of a son is to protect the people he loves when they are at their most vulnerable. That sometimes protecting your family means making incredibly difficult decisions to ensure they are properly looked after when they can no longer look after themselves. The audacity of those words landed like a physical blow. To the guests filling the grand ballroom, Corwin sounded like a devoted son stepping forward to carry the weight of a family tragedy. I knew precisely what he was actually saying. I had read the emails on his tablet. I had seen the medical dossiers and the correspondence with the estate lawyer. He was constructing the narrative for the conservatorship, laying the groundwork to have us declared mentally and physically incompetent. He was telling me to my face that he intended to strip away our rights and seize the Beckett Trust. He expected me to sit there oblivious, drinking in his honeyed words while he honed the blade he planned to drive into my back. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch, and I did not let a single trace of my simmering fury surface on my face. Instead, I smiled, a warm, proud, perfectly constructed fatherly smile. I raised my hands and began to applaud slow, deliberate, measured strikes of my palms. The rest of the ballroom joined in, immediately filling the room with a wave of thunderous applause for the devoted, caring son. Corwin smirked, satisfied with his performance. He believed he had won the psychological chess match. He was convinced he was the most dangerous mind in the room, working the board without opposition. He had absolutely no idea he was already a dead man walking. The formal dinner service had run its course. The plates were cleared, the speeches concluded, and the polyurethane adhesive had completed its silent chemical work. The delicate chantilly lace of the custom Vera Wang bridal gown was permanently, irreversibly bonded to the plush velvet cushion. The clock had run down to 0. The applause for Corwin faded into a quiet, expectant murmur as he stepped confidently back to take his seat at the sweetheart table. What you are about to witness is the moment an entire evening, carefully arranged and methodically controlled, begins to unravel for the people who believed they had already won. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until the proof was undeniable? The grand illusion held together for just a few more fleeting seconds. The master of ceremonies stepped forward again, his booming voice cutting through the soft, ambient music drifting across the room. He invited the guests to bring their attention back to the center of the ballroom. It was time for the bride and groom to share their first dance as husband and wife. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed dramatically, plunging the sprawling room into a romantic, charged twilight. A single brilliant white spotlight sliced through the darkness, landing squarely on the sweetheart table where my son and his new bride were seated. Corwin smiled handsomely for the hundreds of cameras trained on him. He rose with effortless ease, casually fastening his tailored tuxedo jacket. Projecting every inch of the image of a wealthy patriarch in the making, he turned to Sienna and extended his hand to guide his beautiful bride out onto the polished marble dance floor. I sat completely still beside Eloise, breathing slow and steady, watching the final act of their malicious stage play arrive. Sienna glowed beneath the harsh spotlight. She laid her manicured hand into the waiting palm of my son. With her free hand, she gathered the heavy cascading layers of her expensive silk tulle skirt, preparing to rise with the practiced poise of a high society princess. She engaged her legs and shifted her weight forward to stand. She did not move. Her body stayed anchored firmly to the seat. For a brief, disorienting moment, her flawless smile wavered. She looked down at her lap, visibly assuming that some thick fold of her voluminous skirt had snagged under a chair leg or twisted beneath the heel of her designer shoe. She released Corwin's outstretched hand and reached down to free the fabric bunched at her waist. Corwin leaned in slightly, brow creasing in mild confusion, whispering a quick question to her. She shook her head fast, forcing her bright smile back into place for the benefit of the videographers stationed just a few feet away. She gripped the solid wooden edge of the sweetheart table with both hands, bracing to push herself upward with force. She heaved her body forward with a sudden, determined thrust. The thick velvet cushion did not release her. The industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive had cured into an unbreakable bond, permanently welding the delicate chantilly lace of her designer gown to the upholstery beneath her. Because her upper body lurched forward while her lower half stayed hopelessly trapped, the sheer momentum caused the heavy mahogany chair to tip forward on its front legs. She gasped sharply, eyes going wide with sudden, undisguised panic, as she slammed both palms back onto the table to stop herself from pitching over. The chair crashed back onto all four legs with a dull, heavy thud. The flawless facade of the radiant bride cracked apart instantly. The color drained from her carefully contoured face, replaced by a pale, sickly terror. She was no longer smiling. She twisted her torso frantically, craning to look over her own shoulder at whatever was pinning her down. Corwin grabbed her arm, his voice climbing in hushed panic demands, completely blind to the chemical snare holding his wife captive. He yanked her arm, trying to physically haul her upright, before the delay turned into a scene in front of their wealthy guests. The spotlight continued to beat down on both of them without mercy. 300 elite guests sat in breathless, absolute silence. Smartphones raised, recording what was supposed to be a romantic fairy tale moment. Instead, they were watching a bride locked in a desperate, frantic struggle with a piece of banquet furniture. Sienna was hyperventilating now. The crushing weight of thousands of eyes watching her obliterated what remained of her composure. She looked out into the darkness of the ballroom. Her terrified gaze found mine for a fraction of a second. I offered her nothing, not a flicker of sympathy, not a single gesture of mercy. I simply raised my chin, my expression as cold and immovable as a stone monument. Driven by blind panic and the agonizing burn of prolonged public humiliation, she planted both feet flat against the polished marble floor. She let out a breathless, frustrated cry and threw her entire body weight violently forward in one savage heave. The structural integrity of the $18,000 custom wedding gown finally surrendered to the ruthless grip of the cured adhesive. The sound that followed was deafening in the hushed ballroom. A sharp, violent tearing noise cracked through the room like a whip. The exquisite imported silk and hand-stitched lace shredded brutally straight down the center seam. The fabric split completely, ripping from the middle of her spine all the way down past her thighs. The sudden release of tension sent Sienna pitching wildly forward. Her hands skidded off the edge of the sweetheart table, sending crystal champagne flutes and silverware crashing to the floor. She tumbled off the raised platform and plunged downward in a chaotic tangle of shredded white silk and broken tulle. She hit the polished marble dance floor with a heavy, painful thud. The heavy mahogany chair, still permanently cemented to the entire back half of her ruined gown, flipped over with her and scraped across the floor, coming to rest awkwardly on its side just above her. A collective, horrified gasp tore from 300 people simultaneously, a massive wave of pure shock that swept the entire ballroom. Sienna lay sprawled on the cold floor, exposed completely to the merciless glare of the bright white spotlight. The lower half of her dress was utterly destroyed, sheared away entirely, leaving her there in nothing but her sheer undergarments. The exact devastating public humiliation she had gleefully plotted to inflict on my disabled, vulnerable wife had swallowed her whole. Flashes from hundreds of smartphone cameras strobed through the dark room like lightning in a violent storm. The social elite of the city were capturing her total degradation in real time, recording every humiliating detail for the world to see. Corwin stood frozen at the sweetheart table mouth, hanging open in complete, paralyzed shock. He looked down at his new bride sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, then slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. In that moment, he understood. The clueless old man he had believed he was effortlessly manipulating had just executed a flawless, ruthless demolition of his entire life. The jazz band's music sputtered to a discordant, painful stop. I sat perfectly still and felt a fierce, unapologetic wave of satisfaction surge through me. The elaborate trap they had so carefully constructed out of greed, cruelty, and bottomless arrogance had snapped shut around their own necks. Sienna scrambled desperately on the cold marble, sobbing as she clawed at the tattered, ruined shreds of her expensive gown, trying to pull the remains over her exposed legs. But the heavy wooden chair stayed stubbornly fused to her back, mocking her every frantic movement. The pandemonium that erupted across the grand ballroom was unlike anything I had witnessed in 4 decades of managing chaotic construction sites. The initial stunned silence shattered instantly, replaced by a deafening wall of gasps, panicked shouts, and the relentless clicking of hundreds of cameras. The city's social elite were not accustomed to this kind of raw, unfiltered spectacle, and human nature compelled every single one of them to record it. Sienna continued to thrash on the polished floor, her desperate movements amplifying the sickening, tearing sounds of the remaining silk caught against the heavy wooden chair. 2 of her bridesmaids finally broke free of their paralyzed shock. They surged forward and grabbed a long white linen table runner from a nearby dining table, throwing it over Sienna's lower half, in a frantic attempt to shield her exposed undergarments from the spotlight and the flashing lenses of the crowd. Corwin was completely unraveling. The carefully constructed mask of the confident, polished groom had dissolved entirely, leaving behind a terrified, scrambling fraud. He dropped to his knees on the dance floor, grabbing Sienna by the shoulders and trying to haul her upright. But the sheer weight of the mahogany chair, still cemented to her by the cured industrial adhesive, made the effort brutally awkward and physically punishing. Every time he tried to lift her, the chair dragged heavily against the floor, pulling the remaining shreds of her designer gown tighter against her skin. She shrieked in agony and humiliation, slapping his hands away, begging someone to just kill the blinding lights. Corwin shouted furious, incoherent orders at the venue staff, demanding they stop recording and clear a path to the exit. He seized Sienna by the arm and half lifted, half dragged her off the dance floor. It was a pathetic, wretched retreat. Sienna was forced to shuffle forward in a hunched, lurching stance, clutching the linen table runner around her waist, while the heavy banquet chair bobbed and swayed behind her like a grotesque wooden tail. They shoved blindly through the murmuring crowd, leaving behind a trail of shredded white silk and scattered velvet fibers. They made straight for the grand staircase up to the private bridal suites on the second floor, desperate to escape the unrelenting scrutiny of the ballroom. I lingered at the sweetheart table a moment longer, calmly finishing the last of my vintage champagne. I glanced over at Eloise, seated safely in her own chair, her eyes wide with shock at the catastrophic scene that had just played out. I gave her hand a gentle pat and a reassuring nod. I told her to stay comfortable at the table with our friends, and that I'd go upstairs to take care of things. I rose from my seat, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. Then I walked away from the wreckage of the dance floor, steady, unhurried steps toward the grand staircase. I did not rush. A man holding all the winning cards has no need to run. I climbed the marble steps, tracking the unmistakable sounds of hysterical sobbing and furious shouting, ricocheting down the second-floor hallway. I reached the heavy wooden door of the private bridal suite. In their panicked scramble to hide, they'd left it wide open. I stepped into the doorway and took in the full, pathetic wreckage of their perfect evening. What greeted me inside was a portrait of absolute total despair. Sienna lay face down on a plush leather sofa, her face buried in a decorative pillow, wailing without restraint. The heavy mahogany chair jutted straight up into the air above her, a ridiculous monument to her own spectacular failure. Her mother, who had raced upstairs right behind them, stood over her in a state of complete frenzy. She was gripping a pair of sharp floral scissors she'd snatched from a decorative arrangement in the hallway. She was hacking desperately at the thick velvet cushion and the ruined layers of the Vera Wang gown, trying without success to peel the fabric away from the cured polyurethane. But industrial-grade construction adhesive does not yield to simple floral scissors. It bonds fibers at a microscopic level. Every cut she made only unraveled the dress further, leaving the core of the fabric permanently welded to the wood and velvet. Corwin was pacing the length of the bridal suite in tight, furious loops, dragging his trembling hands through his perfectly styled hair. His breathing came heavy and ragged, his face flushed with a mixture of profound humiliation and barely contained rage. He needed somewhere to direct at someone to blame for the implosion of his carefully constructed public image. He stopped mid-stride the moment he spotted me, standing quietly in the doorway. The panic in his eyes flashed instantly into a desperate, aggressive defensiveness. He needed a scapegoat, and he'd defaulted to the assumption that I was still the same pliable, clueless father he could bully and manipulate at will. He crossed the room in a few furious strides and planted himself just feet from where I stood. A shaking finger came up, leveled directly at my chest, his voice climbing into a sharp, accusatory shout. "Look what your venue did," he yelled, face contorting with manufactured outrage. "Look at what happened to her dress. You picked this place. You paid for these cheap, defective chairs. You completely ruined our wedding. You let this happen to us." He stood there heaving, puffing out his chest, trying to reassert some dominance in the room. He expected an immediate apology. He expected me to stumble over my words, to threaten to sue the catering company, to reach for my checkbook, and blindly throw money at the disaster until his bride stopped crying. He was banking on decades of unconditional paternal generosity to shield him from any consequence. I did not apologize. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply looked at his pointing finger, and then I looked directly into his frightened, deceitful eyes. I held my silence, letting his furious accusations hang empty and hollow in the charged air of the suite. I moved fully into the room, stepping past him with calm, deliberate authority. I reached back and took hold of the heavy wooden door. I pulled it shut. I threw the thick brass deadbolt. The loud metallic snap of the lock clicking into place rang through the room like a verdict. It was a definitive, inescapable sound. I turned and pressed my back against the locked door arms folded across my chest. I let the cold, unforgiving weight of my demeanor fill every corner of the space. The effect was immediate and absolute. That single heavy click seemed to pull all the remaining air right out of the bridal suite. Sienna lifted her tear-streaked face from the decorative pillow and stared at me in sudden, bewildered confusion. Her mother went rigid mid-motion, the sharp floral scissors freezing in her trembling grip. Corwin dropped his pointing finger, the aggression dissolving from his shoulders as the terrifying shift in my body language registered. The room went completely dead silent. The silence inside that private bridal suite was total and suffocating. No one moved, no one breathed. I held my position against the locked door for a few seconds more, letting the crushing weight of that silence press their panic flat into submission. Then, I pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly toward the center of the lavishly decorated room. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or curse or hurl anything in blind fury. A man who holds all the undeniable evidence never needs to raise his voice to command a room. I walked past the terrified mother of the bride. I walked past my trembling, sweating son. I stopped directly in front of the large flat-screen television, mounted on the far wall of the bridal suite. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone, tapping the screen a few times to pull up the wireless display settings. A soft, pleasant chime sounded through the suite as my phone paired cleanly with the television. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the ruggedized field audio recorder I had collected from beneath the sweetheart table during the chaotic aftermath of the dress-tearing incident. I held the device up high so every person in that room could see it clearly. In a low-measured and dangerously even tone, I explained that I had personally placed this highly sensitive recording equipment directly beneath their designated chairs just before the evening reception began. Corwin swallowed hard, his throat working visibly as the last of the color drained from his face. I connected the field audio recorder to my phone via a small corded adapter and routed the audio through the premium surround sound speakers installed in the ceiling of the bridal suite. I pressed play. The pristine audio filled the painfully quiet room. The ambient texture of clinking silverware and distant live jazz provided a backdrop for the clear, unmistakable, and deeply incriminating voices of my son and his new bride. The recordings picked up near the tail end of the formal dinner service. Sienna spoke first, her voice pouring through the speakers, thick with bitter, entitled arrogance. She complained that she was far too warm, that her custom-fitted corset was squeezing her ribs too tight. And then came the vicious, malicious words that made her own mother gasp and clap a hand over her mouth in visceral shock. "I am so tired of waiting." Sienna's recorded voice whined loudly through the speakers. "Why hasn't she gotten up to use the restroom yet? I thought you said she had severe bladder control issues. I cannot wait around all night for this pathetic stroke victim to finally embarrass herself." The bridal suite went completely terrifyingly rigid. I watched the father of the bride take a slow, stumbling step backward, as though the sheer cruelty radiating from his daughter had physically struck him. But it was Corwin's response that truly sealed their inescapable doom. His recorded voice let out a soft chuckle, low, dark, and sinister through the high-quality speakers. "Just be patient," my son replied confidently on the recording. "The longer she sits there, the tighter the chemical bond gets. Once she finally stands up, she's going to rip herself wide open. Just make sure your camera is completely ready. We need that massive public meltdown captured on video for the lawyer tomorrow morning." I pressed pause on the ruggedized field audio recorder. The heavy silence that followed was toxic, saturated with the horrifying recognition of their true predatory nature. Sienna let out a muffled, pathetic sob from the plush leather sofa. But nobody moved to comfort her this time. Her mother slowly lowered the sharp floral scissors, staring down at her ruined, half-naked daughter, as though she were looking at someone she had never seen before in her life. Corwin's mouth fell open, his shaking hands rising in a trembling, desperate gesture of surrender. He stammered wildly, trying to claim it was all dark humor, a terrible private joke, blown completely out of proportion by a massive misunderstanding. I didn't give him the chance to finish his cowardly, rambling sentence. I tapped my smartphone screen and opened the heavily encrypted photo gallery where I'd stored the digital evidence pulled from his tablet earlier that afternoon. I mirrored the images directly onto the large television screen. The glaring display of their private text messages lit up the darkened bridal suite for every person in that room to read. I leveled a firm, unwavering finger at the screen and demanded that Sienna's parents read the exact words their daughter had typed with her own hands. There was Sienna's message, explicit, deliberate, coldly plotting to humiliate my disabled wife in front of 300 high society guests in order to manufacture a massive legal advantage. And there was Corwin's response, calculated and ruthless, laying out the financial and legal destruction their planned spectacle was designed to trigger. I swiped to the next image, pulling up the lengthy email thread with the boutique estate attorney. I read the damning words aloud, my voice carrying the full crushing weight of a verdict being handed down from the bench. Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam dunk case for a conservatorship. The words left my mouth flat and stripped of any trace of paternal warmth or forgiveness. We declare Mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation, he will not fight it. We force him to hand over the trust to me immediately today. I swiped to the final screenshot, the most devastating one in the gallery. The words filled the screen at full size, dominating the entire room with their ruthless, unapologetic greed. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. Sienna's parents stood completely frozen in horrified, breathless silence as the true sociopathic nature of their daughter and their new son-in-law was broadcast in inescapable, crystal-clear high definition. For the past year, they had spent every social occasion loudly boasting to their wealthy friends about this prestigious, exclusive family union. Now, they were staring at a pair of cold-blooded predators who had actively conspired to strip an elderly, vulnerable couple of everything they had built. Sienna's mother slowly backed away from the leather sofa, where her daughter was still sobbing into a decorative pillow. She looked absolutely repulsed, staring at the calculating creature she had raised as though seeing it for the first time. Sienna's father shook his head in quiet, profound shame, incapable of meeting my eyes. Corwin stood utterly defeated in the center of the bridal suite. His broad shoulders caved forward, his chest heaving, as the full, inescapable weight of his exposure finally crushed him down to nothing. The arrogant, polished, supremely confident groom had ceased to exist. What remained in his place was a pathetic, hollowed-out fraud, watching his entire master plan collapse to ash right in front of him. He understood in that moment that every layer of his elaborate deception had been quietly, methodically dismantled by the very man he had written off as a harmless old fool. The finality of it hung over the room like a structural beam, giving way no space left for excuses, manufactured apologies, or last-minute bargaining. The trap they had engineered to ensnare my wife had become the inescapable prison of their own construction. I lowered my phone, keeping my eyes locked on my trembling, broken son, and prepared to deliver the final blow that would permanently end the life he had built on lies. The silence in the bridal suite shattered when Corwin choked on his own breath. He lurched forward a step, hands raised in a pleading gesture, eyes darting between the blank television screen and my face, his skin slicked with cold sweat. "Dad, wait!" He stammered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch I hadn't heard since he was a boy, caught breaking a window. "You are taking this entirely out of context. Those messages, the things we said about Mom, they were just jokes. It was just dark humor. We were stressed about the wedding planning, and we were just venting our frustrations. We would never actually do something like that to her. We would never actually try to take your money." I watched him scrambling in real time to assemble a new workable lie right in front of the people who had just seen his moral bankruptcy rendered in high definition. It was genuinely pathetic to observe. I didn't raise my voice, but what came out of me was sharp enough to cut through solid steel. "Do not insult my intelligence, Corwin," I said, slowly stepping deliberately toward him. "You did not simply joke about destroying your mother. You actively retained a boutique estate attorney. You illegally obtained her private medical records. You meticulously engineered a highly public, deeply humiliating physical trap to produce the exact visual evidence your lawyer needed. You built a guillotine, you sharpened the blade, and you placed her neck directly on the block. There is absolutely no context in the universe that justifies what you did today." Corwin's mouth opened to argue, his head shaking frantically, but the words dissolved in his throat as I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. I did not produce another device. I pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of printed documents. I crossed the room to the marble-topped vanity where Sienna had spent that morning preparing for her fraudulent fairy tale. I brought the papers down hard onto the marble surface. The sharp crack made every person in the room flinch at once. Sienna let out a quiet, terrified whimper from the leather sofa, pulling the stolen white table runner tight against her chest. I turned back to my son, eyes burning with the fierce, protective fury of a man who had bled across 4 decades to build a commercial empire. "If you believed your medical conservatorship scheme was the only thing I uncovered today, You have badly underestimated the man who taught you how to read a balance sheet, I said. While you were posing for photographs in the garden this afternoon, I was auditing your corporate email accounts. I watched the blood leave my son's face entirely. He swayed where he stood, his knees visibly buckling beneath the sudden crushing revelation of his exposed financial crimes. He knew exactly what was printed on those documents sitting on the vanity. He knew his sloppy, arrogant accounting trail had finally run out of road. I pointed to the stack of papers, making certain my voice carried clearly enough for Sienna's parents to absorb every word. Those documents contained the complete itemized vendor invoices for this lavish $300 to $1,000 wedding reception. And they also contained the fraudulent corporate budgets for a completely fabricated industrial warehouse project on the west side of the city. I watched Sienna's father shift his stunned gaze toward Corwin. You did not pay for this wedding with personal savings. Corwin and your new bride certainly did not pay for it with her imaginary family wealth. You systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from my commercial operational accounts. You fraudulently mislabeled floral arrangements as heavy-duty landscaping. You expensed a custom designer wedding gown as industrial steel scaffolding. You committed massive corporate felony embezzlement to purchase the approval of a woman who was actively plotting to destroy your own mother. Corwin was shaking all over now. His entire frame trembled as the catastrophic reality of what surrounded him closed in from every direction. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice dropping to a hollow, desperate whisper. "I can pay it back. I will work overtime. I will give you my entire salary. Just keep this in the family. Do not let the partners find out." I crossed my arms and looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. "There is no salary for you to give me, Corwin," I replied, my voice like ice. While you were busy getting into your expensive tuxedo, I was on a private call with Gerald. The mere mention of my corporate attorney's name made Corwin physically recoil. He knew precisely what Gerald was, a legal predator who took genuine pleasure in dismantling corporate liabilities. Gerald has spent the last hour executing a complete and total financial lockdown, I told him. Every single joint operational account you had access to is completely frozen. Your administrative privileges on the servers have been permanently revoked. Your high-limit company credit cards are dead, useless pieces of plastic. You are terminated from your position as Regional Vice President of Operations, effective immediately. You no longer work for me, and you no longer represent my company in any capacity. Sienna let out a loud, devastated wail from the sofa as the realization hit her. The endless river of wealth she believed she had married into had just run completely dry. Corwin dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor of the bridal suite, both hands clutching the sides of his head in a portrait of total, unadulterated despair. But I was not finished. I stepped closer, towering over his kneeling form, making certain my final words would be seared permanently into his memory. "But firing you is simply an administrative necessity." I continued, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "A crime has been committed against my company, and I do not sweep felony embezzlement under the rug to protect a thief, even if that thief carries my last name. Gerald is currently compiling the fraudulent invoices and the fabricated project budgets into a comprehensive formal criminal complaint. That file will be sitting on the desk of the Financial Crimes Division the moment their doors open Monday morning." Corwin looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so raw it bordered on madness. "Dad, no!" he cried out, tears finally breaking loose down his face. "You cannot send me to prison. I am your only son. You cannot do this to me." I looked down at him and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, no hesitation. "You made your choices, Corwin. You decided that money mattered more than your own mother's safety. You decided that everything I spent a lifetime building was simply a resource for you to plunder. You wanted to play the role of a ruthless predator, but you were nothing more than a sloppy, arrogant amateur." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face level with his, and delivered the final, inescapable verdict that would end his life as he knew it. "You wanted to declare someone incompetent to steal a fortune," I said, my voice carrying through the silent, horrified room. "Try doing that with a felony conviction." The weight of that last sentence settled over the room like a collapsing ceiling. Corwin stared up from his knees, eyes wide with terror. The realization that his master plan had crumbled broke something fundamental in his face. The last fragment of his arrogance gave way. He reached out with trembling hands and clutched the fabric of my tailored suit trousers. He begged in a fractured voice, pleading for his freedom, pleading for the father he had spent months plotting to destroy. "Dad, please, you cannot do this." He sobbed, tears running down his pale cheeks. "I am your flesh and blood. You cannot send your own son to federal prison. I will sign away my rights to the trust. Just please call Gerald and tell him to stop the criminal complaint." I looked down at the weeping man at my feet. For my entire adult life, I had worked without rest to hand this boy every advantage I never had. I sacrificed time, energy, and peace of mind, so he would never know the brutal hardships I endured, building my commercial contracting empire from the ground up. I gave him the world on a silver platter, and he answered by trying to construct a legal guillotine for my disabled wife. I searched my chest for some fragment of paternal sympathy. There was nothing there. The well of unconditional love had gone bone dry. The man groveling before me was no longer my child. He was simply a convicted felon, waiting for the authorities to arrive. I reached down and quietly peeled his trembling fingers from my trousers, smoothing the fabric with a calm, dismissive gesture. "You surrendered the right to call yourself my son the moment you chose to weaponize your mother's medical trauma for personal financial gain," I said, my voice stripped of any warmth. "You traded your family for stolen money and a fraudulent social standing. You made your choice, Corwin. Now you get to live with the consequences." Across the room, Sienna let out another agonizing shriek. She was hopelessly tangled in the shredded remains of her Vera Wang gown, her body half bonded to the heavy mahogany banquet chair. The industrial-grade adhesive had cured, fully forging a permanent link between the chantilly lace and the velvet cushion. She thrashed wildly on the plush leather sofa, demanding that her parents pull her out of this disaster. But her parents were no longer interested. Sienna's father stared at his daughter with absolute disgust. He turned his back on the ruined bride, took his wife by the arm, and pulled her silently toward the exit. They walked away deeply ashamed of what they had raised. Sienna understood then that her wealthy safety net had evaporated, that the vast fortune she thought she'd married into was gone, that corporate embezzlement charges were waiting for her, alongside a disgraced husband. She curled into a pathetic ball on the sofa, the stolen white table runner clutched against her chest, permanently fused to the wooden monument of her own cruelty. I turned away from the wreckage in the center of that room. I walked slowly toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. Corwin scrambled across the carpet behind me, his voice climbing in a final desperate crescendo of pure panic. "Dad, do not walk out that door," he screamed, his voice cracking apart. "If you leave right now, my life is completely over. Please, I am begging you. Do not leave me here like this." I did not break my stride. I reached out and gripped the cold brass deadbolt I had thrown just minutes earlier. I turned the mechanism and pulled it back with a sharp click. I took the ornate handle and swung the heavy door wide open, flooding the suite with the bright light of the hallway beyond. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not offer a single word of farewell. I stepped out of the bridal suite and let the heavy door swing shut behind me, severing every tie to that room and the people inside it. For good. I walked down the hallway head high. I reached the marble staircase and began my descent. The atmosphere in the grand foyer had shifted considerably. The shock of the dress-tearing spectacle had curdled into a restless current of wealthy socialites, whispering eagerly about the public ruin of the newlyweds. Clusters of elegantly dressed guests stood in tight circles, smartphones raised, passing around the footage of the bride hitting the floor with a chair bonded to her back. I paid no attention to the stares or the hushed voices. I moved with calm, deliberate purpose through the towering floral arrangements and back into the grand ballroom. The live jazz band was packing away their brass instruments, the festive atmosphere long since shattered. Waiters moved quietly, collecting the last of the crystal champagne flutes. I made my way through the labyrinth of circular dining tables, my eyes fixed on the raised platform at the front of the room. Eloise was sitting perfectly upright in her designated chair, regal, composed, and entirely unbroken, despite the storm that had swept through the evening around her. Her beautiful custom silk gown fell flawlessly around her legs, untouched by the malicious chemical trap I had dismantled. She watched me approach, her kind eyes moving carefully across my face for any sign of distress. I reached the table and stopped in front of her. I offered her a warm, genuine, deeply reassuring smile. I unbuttoned my suit jacket and drew it from my shoulders. I draped it carefully around her. I leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Are you ready to go home, my love?" I asked quietly. She reached up and patted my cheek. "I am perfectly ready," she replied, her voice steady and sure. She took hold of her polished wooden cane and pushed herself up from the table. She stood tall and strong, free of the toxic snare they had laid for her. I offered her my arm. She slipped her hand through mine. We turned our backs on the lavish sweetheart table and walked slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The remaining guests parted before us, opening a wide path to the doors. We stepped through the heavy oak entrance and into the cool night air, leaving the whispers, the shattered silk, and the smoldering ruins of my son's life behind us in the dark. Forever. Exactly 1 year has passed since that night at the grand ballroom. The crisp night air that greeted Eloise and me as we walked out of the luxury venue felt like the very first breath of a completely new life. When you spend 4 decades constructing a commercial contracting empire, you grow deeply familiar with the relentless, crushing weight of constant responsibility. You train yourself to carry the massive burdens of your employees, your active job sites, and your ungrateful family without ever allowing yourself to complain. But as those heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, sealing the wreckage of that wedding reception away forever, that suffocating weight finally lifted from my shoulders. I understood in that moment that my profound obligation to protect and provide for my son had officially run its course. He was no longer my responsibility. He was simply a hostile adversary who had badly miscalculated his opponent. The following Monday morning, I did precisely what I had promised. Gerald, my ruthless corporate attorney, walked straight into the financial crimes division of the local police department and delivered the comprehensive embezzlement file. The authorities moved with terrifying efficiency. While the detectives began assembling their airtight criminal case against my son, I launched a sweeping strategic overhaul of my own professional life. For years, I had held on to Beckett Commercial Contracting because I believed I was forging a generational legacy to hand down to Corwin. With that toxic illusion permanently demolished, there was no reason left to keep grinding myself into the dirt in the demanding world of commercial construction. I quietly placed my entire company on the market. Because the business was highly profitable, structurally sound, and completely purged of the financial rot Corwin had temporarily introduced, it drew multiple aggressive buyers within weeks. I ultimately sold the corporation to a large national development conglomerate for a staggering 8-figure sum. I took that surge of liquid capital, combined it with my existing wealth, and fully restructured the Beckett Trust. I made certain that the financial firewall Gerald had built around Eloise and me was absolutely impenetrable. While I was busy liquidating assets and securing a stress-free retirement, Corwin was getting his first brutal taste of the criminal justice system. The formal investigation into his fraudulent warehouse project was swift and devastating. The digital paper trail he'd left behind was breathtakingly sloppy, a vivid testament to the blinding arrogance that had defined him. He had genuinely convinced himself that hiding behind my forged signature would insulate him from all accountability. Instead, it handed federal prosecutors a clean, undeniable timeline of his felony embezzlement. When investigators confronted him with the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence, his expensive defense attorney counseled him to take a plea deal. Corwin ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corporate fraud and grand theft. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting his final sentencing hearing next month. The presiding judge has already made clear that he is staring down a mandatory minimum of 7 to 10 years in federal prison. There will be no leniency, no wealthy father arriving to cover his restitution, and no comfortable safety net waiting on the other side. He traded a lifetime of guaranteed security and family support for a few months of stolen luxury and the sickening thrill of plotting against his own mother. He is now learning the profound difference between a temporary victory and a permanent, devastating defeat. Sienna fared no better in the wreckage of her spectacular public humiliation. The instant she grasped that Corwin had been completely severed from the Beckett fortune, her shallow, opportunistic devotion evaporated without a trace. She filed for a rapid divorce just 3 weeks after the disastrous wedding reception, desperately trying to put legal distance between herself and his mounting criminal charges and financial liabilities. Her cowardly attempt at self-preservation, however, did nothing to shield her from the crushing weight of her own decisions. The fraudulent funds Corwin had used to finance the extravagant wedding were seized and reclaimed by the authorities during the corporate audit. Sienna and her pretentious parents were suddenly held legally responsible for the outstanding vendor balances. She is currently drowning in insurmountable debt, being relentlessly pursued by collection agencies for the canceled honeymoon packages and the ruined $18,000 designer gown. She lost her social standing, her wealthy lifestyle, and her polished public image in a single humiliating evening. She is now a permanent social pariah, forever remembered as the malicious bride who ended up physically bonded to a banquet chair in her undergarments. As for Eloise and me, we chose to leave the toxicity and the legal wreckage far behind us entirely. We are currently sitting on the private balcony of a luxury suite aboard a magnificent cruise ship making its way slowly across the crystal-clear, sapphire waters of the Caribbean Sea. A warm ocean breeze carries the scent of salt and freedom, a striking contrast to the heavy, poisoned air of our former lives. Eloise has made a remarkable and inspiring recovery over these past 12 months. Liberated from the dark, suffocating stress and the unseen pressure our son had relentlessly placed upon her, her physical therapy advanced with incredible speed. She no longer needs her wooden cane to walk the deck of the ship. She moves with a renewed and vibrant strength, her face lit by genuine happiness and deep peace. We fill our days exploring ancient coastal cities, savoring extraordinary food, and enjoying the immense wealth we forged together across 40 long years. We are completely untethered from the greedy hands that tried to drain our resources and strip away our dignity. Sitting here, watching a blazing sunset paint the horizon in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, I've arrived at a quiet but powerful understanding about the true nature of family. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It does not automatically guarantee unconditional love. It does not compel blind respect, and it certainly does not excuse calculated, deliberate cruelty toward vulnerable people. True family is built on a solid and unbreakable foundation, unwavering loyalty, deep mutual respect, and a fierce instinctual drive to shield one another from harm. Eloise and I constructed a beautiful, enduring, and remarkably successful life together through decades of shared sacrifice and mutual devotion. We defended that precious life when it was threatened by the very person who should have cherished and protected it most. We came through the storm. Now we finally get to stand in the sunlight. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to bleed you dry. We spend our lives building a legacy blinded by unconditional love, looking past the warning signs, because we desperately want to believe the best about our children. That is where the story of Franklin and Eloise Beckett leaves us, not in the wreckage of a wedding reception, but on a quiet balcony above the Caribbean Sea, watching the sun go down on a life they nearly had stolen from them. I won't pretend it didn't cost something. Cutting off your own son, watching him drop to his knees and beg, that is not a victory a man celebrates. It is a wound that heals slowly if it heals at all. But I believe God has a way of bringing the truth to the surface when the time is right. Franklin didn't plan for justice in anger. He built it in silence with patience and evidence, and he let it speak for itself. That is what I carry from this story. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything, it is this: the people who underestimate a quiet man are almost always wrong. And for those of you who find comfort in father stories like this one, I hope you see something worth holding on to. Here is what I take away, and I offer it to you plainly. Do not let love become a blindfold. Loyalty to family is a virtue, but not when it enables cruelty. Document everything. A patient man with evidence is always more powerful than an angry man with none. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, not their words, believe them completely. Protecting the people you love sometimes means making the hardest decision of your life. Do not mistake mercy for weakness. If this story moved you, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today, a friend, a sibling, someone carrying something heavy. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one. Take good care of yourselves.